Sofia's existence was overshadowed by fear, as she suffered relentless abuse at the hands of her father. She encountered death 3 times, each time experiencing extraordinary events. From floating in a radiant light to sensing a supernatural presence, she ventured beyond the realm of life. These near-death experiences transformed her perception of pain, love, and forgiveness, altering not just her, but also the man who had caused her the most harm. My name is Sofia. Fear was a constant companion in my childhood. It permeated our home, much like the scent of cigarettes and alcohol. My father's anger was a storm, always brewing, always unpredictable. His fists were more than just weapons, they were verdicts, constant reminders of my vulnerability and powerlessness. Some nights he'd storm in, making the walls tremble. My sister Maria and I would exchange anxious glances, silently preparing ourselves. If we were fortunate, he'd pass out in his chair, whiskey in hand. Otherwise, those were the nights I tried to erase from memory. His favorite pastime was smashing my head between his fists, a cruel form of entertainment. Other times he'd hurl me against the walls so hard the pictures would shake. Once, when I was about 7, he dragged me by my hair across the kitchen floor for spilling milk. "Useless," he muttered with chilling calmness. Maria suffered too, though in different ways, perhaps because she was older or fought back in ways I couldn't. One night he held a gun to her head. She didn't cry like I did. She met his gaze, lips trembling, chin firm. "Do it," she whispered. "Just do it." He didn't, but the knowledge that he could have, that we both knew he could have, made it worse. She left as soon as she could, for college, leaving me alone with our ghost of a mother, filled with resentment and envy. Mom was physically present but emotionally absent, her eyes distant, fixed on some unseen horizon. Once, bloody and bruised, I begged her to help me. She blinked, turned to me for a moment, then sighed, tightening her hands around her coffee mug. That moment ended my pleas for help, but books became my solace, my escape. I devoured anything I could find, library books, forgotten paperbacks in Mom's room, even the backs of cereal boxes. In those pages, I wasn't just Sofia, the terrified girl in a broken home. I was someone else, someone braver, stronger, someone who could fight back. Church offered another refuge, though for different reasons. My parents had once attended a church, but they were asked to leave before I could understand why. They never went back, but I did. Every Sunday I'd go to the small church down our street, sit in the back pew, and listen. I loved the preacher's words about love, kindness, and a God who saw everything and still chose to love us. I wanted to believe that. I needed to. Yet sometimes I wondered, if God sees everything, why didn't he stop him? Why did he let my father hurt me? Why did he let my mother turn away? I once asked a sweet Sunday school teacher with gray hair and kind eyes. She smiled and said, "God gives us free will, dear. He doesn't force people to choose to do bad things." I nodded, pretending to understand, but her answer felt hollow. At night in the quiet house, I'd lie in bed staring at the cracks in the ceiling, whispering prayers into the darkness. "God, are you there? Do you love me?" The silence that followed was crushing. I was 9 years old when I died for the first time. I don't remember what caused it. One moment I was hurting, the next I was light. I found myself hovering above our backyard, unsure of how I got there. The thick hedges that surrounded our yard kept it hidden from the outside world. My father liked it that way. It meant his rage and actions went unnoticed. But at that moment, I wasn't thinking about him or the pain. For the first time, I felt liberated. I moved effortlessly, without fear or the usual weight on my chest. Below me, the grass swayed gently, even though there was no breeze. The sun shone, but I didn't feel its warmth. I wasn't a body anymore. I was pure awareness, alive in a way I'd never experienced. Then I saw it, a brilliant light above me, beyond the sky itself. It wasn't like the sun. It didn't burn or blind. It was soft, boundless, more real than anything I'd ever seen. Instantly, I understood what it was. God, not as I'd imagined him in church, not a figure on a throne. This was different, pure presence, pure love, filling every part of me. I hadn't realized how empty I was until I felt that love, like I'd been starving my whole life without knowing it. Then he spoke, not with words, but inside me, beyond sound, something I understood rather than heard. "You are here because you have a purpose." A wave of bliss washed over me, the certainty that God had a plan for me. Me, the unwanted girl who'd only known pain, I found it almost too much to comprehend. "Do you want to continue?" I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't need it. Somehow, I understood he was giving me a choice: stay with him or return to my life. Without hesitation, I said yes. I would do anything for him. I didn't care what it entailed. All I knew was that I wanted to serve him, do whatever he asked. Then you must be baptized. Those words filled me with a profound joy, even though I couldn't fully understand why. At the time, I thought the baptism itself was my purpose, the reason for my return. Now I wonder if it was more than that. Maybe it was meant as a message to my father. Maybe it was to show him I was dead, that God existed, and his power was limited. Before I could ask anything else, the light dimmed and I fell. It wasn't like waking from a dream, it was a crash, a sudden, violent return to my body. My limbs were heavy, my head throbbed, and the air was thick with heat and disappointment. I was back. The love was gone, but there was work to do. I struggled to my feet and stumbled inside, my legs unsteady. My father was in the cellar. I called to him, my voice faint but urgent. "I need to talk to you." There was a long silence, then the sound of footsteps on the stairs. He appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Wait for me in the backyard," he said. I obeyed. My heart pounded, yet I wasn't afraid, not in the usual way. When he joined me outside and sat on the steps, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "I need to be baptized," I said. He frowned, his eyes narrowing. "Why?" he asked. I swallowed hard. "Because I want to serve God." His eyes flickered with something. It wasn't anger, it was something else. Fear. "Did someone from church tell you to do this?" he asked. "No," I shook my head. "God told me." His whole body stiffened. He stared at me for what felt like forever before finally saying, "I'll talk to the pastor." His voice was hoarse, uncertain. Then, after a pause, "Don't tell your mother. She'll worry." I didn't reply. A week later, I was in the church's baptismal font, the cool water on my skin. The congregation murmured as I stepped forward. I was the youngest person to ever be baptized there. My father watched from the pews, his face pale. The pastor's hand pressed against my back as he spoke the familiar words. "I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." I went under. The water closed over me, muffling the world. For a fleeting moment I thought, maybe I'll come back. Maybe God will take me home now. But when I resurfaced, I was still there. The congregation applauded. My father remained motionless. The next morning, nothing had changed. It was the same. The abuse continued, the violence persisted. But I had changed. I didn't know my purpose, but I knew I had triumphed, and for now that was enough. I don't remember my exact age when it happened, only that I was very sick. A fever burned through my body, my head throbbed, and I felt too weak to move. All day, I lay on the living room couch, barely aware of the world around me. Eventually, the fever intensified. The very air around me grew thick, pressing against my skin like an invisible weight, and my vision began to blur. Then, in an instant, I was no longer just seeing the room. Numbers appeared, no longer still. They moved and flowed before me like equations on a phantom chalkboard. I wasn't just looking at them. I understood them, even though I had no right to. Intricate formulas materialized before my eyes, shifting and rearranging themselves as if solving their own riddles. Equations I had never learned and concepts far beyond my grasp suddenly became clear. I could have explained it all if someone had asked, but I had no idea where this sudden insight came from, and truthfully, I didn't want it. There was something deeply wrong, almost unnatural. I'd always struggled with math, and now I knew things I should never have known, an awareness that terrified me. Desperate for some stability, I needed to find my mother. With great effort, I pushed myself off the couch, my legs shaky as I made my way to the kitchen. There she sat at the table, staring blankly ahead as always. "Mom?" I called, my voice strangely echoing. "I don't feel good." She didn't react. I moved closer and waved my hand in front of her face, but she didn't blink, didn't stir, didn't acknowledge me in any way. Panic swelled inside me. Why wasn't she responding? Confused, I turned back towards the living room and froze. I was there, lying on the couch, motionless. I stared at my body, my mind struggling to process the vision. I was in two places at once. For what seemed like an eternity, I stood there, observing my pale self, my breath rapid and shallow. Then a force yanked me back, and suddenly I was whole again in my body, its weight pressing down on me, the fever still raging, my skin slick with sweat, and my limbs heavy with fatigue. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. Was it just a feverish delusion? The numbers, my mother's coldness, even seeing myself on the couch. I tried to convince myself it was just a disturbing hallucination caused by illness. But years later, after other experiences, I would understand what it truly was. I had left my body for a moment, and in that brief gap, I was more than just a sick, helpless child. I was 16 the night I decided I couldn't take it anymore. The bruises from my father's last beating had barely faded, and every breath sent a jolt of pain through my ribs. Yet the physical torment was only part of it. It was his words. The look in his eyes after he'd punched me so hard I'd fallen to my knees, gasping for air. "I hate you," he'd said, his voice eerily calm, almost thoughtful. He'd even added, "I thought about killing you, but I don't want to get caught." That cold sentence broke something inside me. I'd always known he despised me, but hearing him say it with such indifference made me feel less than human, like I wasn't even worth the pretense of love. That night, lying in bed, I whispered a final prayer. "God, please let me die." And then the pain came. A sudden, devastating explosion at the base of my skull, as if my head were about to split open, overwhelmed me. It was unlike anything I'd ever felt, sharper than any migraine, more intense than any wound my father had inflicted. My entire body stiffened, locked in agony. And then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the pain vanished. I exhaled slowly, but something was wrong. The heaviness of my body was gone. The bed beneath me dissolved. The entire world around me had disappeared. I was floating in nothingness. No light, no sound. Nothing but an endless, consuming darkness. At first I wasn't afraid. If this was death, it possessed a strange, tranquil quality. I felt light, detached. But then, gradually, a chilling realization crept in. I was still thinking, I was still aware. I shouldn't have been aware. I should have been gone. Panic seized me. Was this hell? Was I trapped here forever? I squinted into the darkness, desperately searching for some sign of escape. A door, a light, some indication that something, anything lay beyond this infinite void. And then it emerged. Not a tunnel, not a shape, but a presence. It didn't come from outside of me. It came from everywhere, as if from every direction at once. A force so immense, so powerful, so tender that it washed over me like a cascade of warm water. God, not in the form of a man or a spoken word, but as the sum of all things. In that instant, I understood everything, not in a way that can be expressed with language. Words seemed too small. Yet suddenly, clarity reigned. The universe, existence, love, purpose, it was all so clear, so unmistakable. And I laughed. How had I missed it all this time? I was cherished. I had always been cherished, even in my darkest moments. I had never been truly alone, but just as quickly as this realization came, it began to slip away. I was still floating, but now I found myself elsewhere. In a cave bathed in a soft, pulsating light, I pressed myself against a jagged stone wall, hiding. I couldn't explain why I felt the need to hide. I just knew I wasn't supposed to be there. And then I saw her. She appeared, luminous and ethereal, her form shifting like the vibrant hues of the northern lights. Though her outline was human, she wasn't entirely human. Long limbs, an elongated head, and immense dark eyes that seemed to hold the entire cosmos. An alien. I should have been scared, but I wasn't. She was. She tilted her head slightly, and even without eyebrows or any obvious expression, I sensed her surprise and unease. She was scared of me. "Aren't you going to stop hiding?" echoed silently in my mind. It wasn't spoken aloud, but it arrived just as God had spoken to me once. Only now it was her voice. She knew I was there, so there was no longer any reason to stay hidden. I took a hesitant step forward, meeting her gaze. "You're beautiful," I whispered, though my own voice sounded distant. She didn't reply. Her immense dark eyes searched mine with an inscrutable intensity. I couldn't tell if she'd registered the compliment or simply didn't know how to react. Then I noticed it. Behind her, carved into the cave wall, was a giant screen. It was flat and radiant, broadcasting my life. Scenes and memories, both lived and forgotten, flashed before my eyes. But I wasn't interested in reliving my past. "Why do you keep showing me this? I already know my life," I asked. "I want to know about you." Instead of answering, she shifted her gaze between me and the screen. I sighed and turned back to watch a new scene unfold. There I was on my high school stage, with an auditorium full of students, teachers, and parents gathered around. It was the school musical, and I was the lead, 7 solos with no understudy. The realization hit me hard. If I died, the show would be canceled. If I was gone, my friends would be devastated. I had convinced myself that my absence wouldn't matter, that no one would notice. Yet here was irrefutable proof that my life impacted those around me. I couldn't bear to hurt them. The moment that understanding struck me, the cave dissolved. I was suddenly yanked backward, as if a rope had been wrapped around my chest, pulling me through infinite space at impossible speed until, with a jarring impact, I was thrown back into my body. The force was so intense that I doubled over and vomited. My head pounded, my limbs trembled, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I was alive, and somehow I knew what I needed to do. The next morning, I woke up feeling different. My body still hurt, the bruises ached, but something inside me had shifted. The anger, the despair, and the deep resentment I'd carried for so long were gone. In their place, understanding had grown. I wasn't excusing what my father had done, nor was I pretending it hadn't happened. For the first time, I saw him clearly, not just as my abuser, but as a man burdened by his own pain, his own wounds, and his own loneliness. That pain had twisted him into a cruel person. I realized then that people hurt others when they feel unloved. He had never learned to love, so he could neither give it nor receive it. I remembered how God had loved me in my need unconditionally, without judgment or anger. If I had been given that kind of love, maybe I was meant to share it with others, even him. But how? I couldn't bring myself to say I love you. Those words felt impossible, yet I could express love through my thoughts. So I started small. I searched for one good quality in him, something to hold on to, something to cherish. And I found it. Gardening. Despite all the terrible things my father had done, he had always taken care of our garden. While our house was filled with fear, the world outside bloomed with life. Roses, fruit trees, and vibrant flowering bushes, all nurtured by his hands. So I made a choice. Every time he yelled at me, I would ignore his harsh words. Instead, I would silently repeat, "You're a great gardener. You're a great gardener. You're a great gardener." With each repetition, I imagined love radiating from me like a light, filling the space between us. At first, nothing changed. He continued to yell, to glare at me with that familiar rage. Then something unexpected happened. One evening, as he raised his hand as if to strike me, he hesitated. He stopped. His face twisted in confusion, as if something inside him was breaking. Weeks turned into months. The yelling became less frequent, and the rage in his eyes began to fade. Then, one day, he looked at me, not with anger or hatred, but with a look I had never seen before: regret. "It feels like you're the only person in the world who cares about me," he murmured, his voice barely audible. I had never told him I loved him, not once, but somehow, he sensed it. For years, I kept my near-death experiences a secret. I knew what people would say, that I imagined it, that it was just a trick of the mind, a hallucination born from trauma. Even my sister dismissed it, shaking her head and calling it Stockholm Syndrome, unable to understand why I chose to forgive him. But I hadn't just forgiven him, I had truly seen him. My friends, the ones who valued science over faith, insisted that near-death experiences were nothing more than dying neurons firing random images, like a plate of spaghetti. But I know what I felt. It was more real than this everyday life. Now I understand. Love is the most powerful force in the universe, and suffering exists because it is absent. Those who hurt others, who lash out with cruelty, are often the ones who need love the most. I don't claim to have all the answers, but I choose to live differently now. I choose to love, even when it's hard. And if there's one thing I've learned from my time beyond this world, it's that even in our darkest moments, we are never truly alone.